The Galloping Apocalypse. In the ancient texts of forgotten lore, there are whispers of a prophecy, a warning of the end times when the four horsemen of the apocalypse would ride forth, bringing destruction and chaos to the world of mortals. For centuries, this prophecy remained nothing more than a myth, a cautionary tale passed down through generations. But in the quiet town of Willowbrook, the legend was about to become a terrifying reality. Willowbrook was a picturesque town nestled in the heart of a lush valley. Life here was simple and peaceful, with the residents going about their daily routines, blissfully unaware of the impending doom that lurked on the horizon. The town had a rich history, dating back to the early settlers who had carved out a life in this idyllic corner of the world. On a chilly autumn evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky above Willowbrook began to change. The wan blue expanse slowly transformed into an eerie shade of crimson, casting an otherworldly glow across the landscape. The air grew still, and an unnatural silence descended upon the town. The residents, initially mesmerized by the strange phenomenon, soon felt a creeping sense of unease. Some claimed to hear the distant sound of hoofbeats echoing through the empty streets. Others reported seeing shadowy figures on the outskirts of town, their forms barely visible in the gathering darkness. As the night wore on, the sense of foreboding only grew stronger. The animals became restless, their cries piercing the eerie silence. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees and rattling the windows of the old houses. Something was coming, and the people of Willowbrook could feel it in their bones. In the early hours of the morning, just before dawn, the four horsemen of the apocalypse made their entrance. They rode into town on steeds of unearthly beauty and terror, their hooves striking the ground with a thunderous sound that shook the very foundations of the earth. The first horseman, mounted on a white horse, was known as Pestilence. He carried a bow and arrow, and his face was hidden beneath a hood of pure white. As he rode through the streets, a sickly green mist billowed out from beneath his cloak, enveloping everything in its path. The second horseman, astride a fiery red steed, was War. He wielded a great sword that gleamed with an unholy light, and his eyes burned with the fury of 1,000 battles. Where he passed, the ground was scorched and barren, and the air was filled with the stench of blood and smoke. Famine, the third horseman, rode a black horse that was as dark as the starless night sky. He carried a pair of scales in his bony hands, and his gaunt face was etched with the lines of eternal hunger. As he rode, the crops in the fields withered and died, and the animals fell to the ground, their bodies wasted and shriveled. The fourth and final horseman was Death, mounted on a pale horse that seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. He gripped a scythe in his skeletal hands, and his face was a grinning skull beneath his tattered hood. Where he passed, the living fell like puppets whose strings had been cut, their souls reaped by his merciless blade. The townspeople, roused from their slumber by the commotion, stumbled out of their homes and into the streets. They watched in horror as the four horsemen rode through Willowbrook, leaving destruction and despair in their wake. Some tried to flee, only to be cut down by the horsemen's weapons. Others fell to their knees, praying for salvation that would never come. As the sun rose over Willowbrook, the true horror of the four horsemen's arrival became apparent. The sickly green mist that had followed Pestilence now hung over the town like a shroud, seeping into every crack and crevice. Those who inhaled the miasma soon fell ill with a mysterious disease that ravaged their bodies and minds. The symptoms were unlike anything the town doctor had ever seen. The afflicted individuals developed high fevers, their skin covered in grotesque, oozing blisters. They coughed up blood and suffered from debilitating pain that left them writhing in agony. The disease spread like wildfire, passing from person to person with frightening speed. The hospital quickly became overwhelmed, its beds filled with the sick and dying. The staff worked tirelessly to treat the patients, but they too began to fall ill, succumbing to the same fate as those they sought to heal. The streets were littered with the bodies of the dead, their faces twisted in expressions of unimaginable suffering. Amidst the chaos, a young nurse named Sarah emerged as a beacon of hope. She tended to the sick with unwavering compassion, risking her own health to provide comfort and care to those in need. Despite the growing despair that gripped the town, Sarah refused to give up, determined to find a way to stop the plague. As Pestilence's influence spread, War's presence began to take hold. The one peaceful town descended into chaos as neighbor turned against neighbor, fighting over dwindling resources and blaming one another for the calamity that had befallen them. The streets became a battleground, with armed groups vying for control. Looters ransacked abandoned homes, taking whatever they could carry. The sound of gunfire and screams echoed through the town, a constant reminder of the violence that had consumed Willowbrook. Sarah, who had seen the worst of human nature in the hospital, knew that she had to act. She gathered a small group of survivors, those who had managed to resist the pull of war's influence. Together they set out to restore order and protect the innocent. They clashed with the marauding gangs, engaging in fierce battles that left the streets stained with blood. Sarah, armed with her medical knowledge and a newfound strength, fought alongside her companions, determined to save as many lives as she could. But even as they made progress, the specter of war loomed over them, threatening to tear apart the fragile alliances they had forged. As the town struggled to cope with the twin threats of pestilence and war, famine began to tighten its grip. The crops in the fields, once lush and bountiful, withered and died, turning to dust beneath the hooves of the black horse. The town's food supplies, already strained by the chaos, dwindled rapidly. The survivors, their bodies weakened by hunger and disease, grew desperate. Some resorted to scavenging for scraps, while others turned to more unsavory means to satisfy their gnawing hunger. Sarah and her group, recognizing the urgency of this situation, set out to find a solution. They searched abandoned farms and raided empty storehouses, gathering what meager supplies they could find. But it was never enough. As the days turned into weeks, the situation grew increasingly dire. The starving inhabitants of Willowbrook, their minds clouded by hunger, began to turn on one another. Reports of cannibalism surfaced, whispered in fearful tones by those who had witnessed the unspeakable. Sarah, horrified by the depths to which her one peaceful town had sunk, redoubled her efforts to find a way to break famine's hold. But even as she searched for answers, the grim specter of death loomed ever closer. With pestilence, war, and famine having ravaged Willowbrook, death arrived to claim its due. The pale horse and its rider moved through the streets like a ghostly apparition, the scythe gleaming in the sickly light that filtered through the miasma. The town, already a shell of its former self, became a true ghost town as the last of the survivors fell to death's inexorable advance. The streets were silent, save for the mournful wails of the dying and the whisper of the pale horse's hoofs on the blood-stained cobblestones. Sarah, one of the few remaining survivors, watched helplessly as her companion succumbed to death's touch. She had fought so hard, sacrificed so much, only to see her efforts crumble to dust in the face of the Fourth Horseman's power. But even in her darkest hour, Sarah refused to surrender. She delved into the town archives, searching for any clue that might help her understand the origin of the Four Horsemen and the key to defeating them. It was there, amidst the dusty tomes and faded parchments, that she stumbled upon the truth. The record spoke of a dark secret, buried deep in Willowbrook's past. Centuries ago, the town's founders had made a pact with the forces of darkness, a Faustian bargain that promised prosperity and power in exchange for the lives of their descendants. The Four Horsemen, it seemed, were the collectors of this ancient debt, summoned forth to reap the souls of Willowbrook's inhabitants when the time was right. The crimson sky, the eerie silence, the unnatural phenomena, all were signs of the coming apocalypse, the fulfillment of the founders' grim pact. Armed with this knowledge, Sarah knew what had to be done. She gathered the last of the survivors, those who had managed to cling to life in the face of unimaginable horror. Together, they formed a plan to confront the Four Horsemen and break the curse that had doomed their town. In the heart of Willowbrook, beneath the shadow of the old clock tower, Sarah and her ragtag band of survivors prepared for their final stand. They had gathered what weapons they could find, from ancient tomes of magic to the cold steel of firearms. As the Four Horsemen rode into the square, their forms radiating an aura of malevolence, Sarah stepped forward to face them. She held an ancient artifact aloft, a relic that had been hidden away in the town archives, imbued with the power to banish the horsemen back to the abyss. The battle that followed was fierce and bloody. The horsemen, their powers amplified by centuries of anticipation, fought with a fury that threatened to overwhelm the survivors. Sarah and her companions, fueled by desperation and a refusal to surrender, met them head-on. In the end, it was Sarah who struck the final blow. With a cry of defiance, she unleashed the power of the artifact, channeling its energy into the Four Horsemen. The effect was immediate and devastating. The horsemen, their forms writhing in agony, began to disintegrate, their essence drawn back into the void from whence they had come. But the victory was not without cost. Sarah, her body ravaged by the battle and the strain of wielding the artifact, collapsed to the ground, her life ebbing away. As her companions gathered around her, she smiled weakly, knowing that she had given her life to save her town and its people. In the years that followed, Willowbrook slowly began to rebuild. The survivors, their bonds forged in the crucible of shared trauma, worked tirelessly to restore their shattered community. The memory of Sarah and the sacrifices she had made lived on, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable darkness. But even as the town healed, the specter of the Four Horsemen lingered. The survivors knew that the forces of evil were never truly vanquished, merely held at bay. They whispered of the day when the horsemen might return, called forth by the echoes of the ancient pact that had brought them to Willowbrook. And so, the town remained vigilant, always watching the horizon for the first sign of a crimson sky. They passed down the story of Sarah and the Four Horsemen, a reminder of the eternal struggle between good and evil, and the price that must be paid to keep the darkness at bay. For in the end, Willowbrook had learned that the only way to triumph over the apocalypse was to stand together, united in the face of oblivion. And though the road ahead was long and fraught with peril, they knew that as long as they had each other, there was always hope for a brighter tomorrow.